since it broke, nearly 36 people are behind bars after a massive drug bust in Lorain County, and they all have something in common.
At 4:32 in the morning in Chicago, while the city lay in deep, unbroken sleep, a silent federal convoy slipped into the administrative district, signaling the sudden collapse of a terrifying empire of power. This was no ordinary drug bust, but the unmasking of a criminal pipeline buried inside the governor's office itself, implicating 112 bribed officials. Tons of lethal narcotics and $410 million were flawlessly hidden behind official seals. What dark secret had turned a system designed to protect citizens into a shield for organized crime? The truth behind the largest political infiltration in history will force you to completely reconsider the system we have always trusted. The Drug Enforcement Administration announced it was doubling down on an already massive campaign against those profiting from the deadliest substance ever unleashed on the public. At 4:32 in the morning in Chicago, Illinois, records revealed 112 officials had been bribed. A sitting governor became a target. 3.4 tons of narcotics were seized, along with $410 million in laundered cash. This was not a routine drug bust. It was a deep breach of the political system itself. A hidden criminal pipeline had embedded directly into the state's power structure. By 5:41 in the morning in Chicago, Illinois, with the city still wrapped in sleep, a federal convoy moved steadily through the administrative district. No sirens screamed, no flashing lights tore through the gray, bitter dawn. Only the low, steady rumble of engines disturbed the silence. Frost clung to the parked cars lining the street. Office windows stood pitch black, lifeless. Nothing hinted that history was seconds from being exposed. The target was not a warehouse or a border checkpoint. It was the executive office in Chicago of Governor Hassan Abdir Rahman, a leader once celebrated for his meteoric political ascent. At exactly 5:41, the reinforced door was breached in mere seconds. Agents surged forward, fast, silent, weapons raised. Inside, the room looked deceptively normal. Polished wooden desks, neatly framed photographs, the state flag positioned beside the national one. Symbols of public trust dominated the space, until that illusion abruptly crumbled. Concealed behind a locked filing cabinet, agents discovered 9.5 kilograms of cocaine secured inside a safe alongside detailed financial documents. The bricks were carefully wrapped in medical supply packaging to avoid detection. Beneath the floor, a hidden compartment revealed tactical equipment and encrypted hard drives. This was not an external breach of the system. It was corruption festering at its core. Governor Hassan Abdir Rahman and his wife had operated with precision, without haste, without panic, without a single visible misstep. This was not crime driven by desperation. Behind the governor's speeches and ceremonial smiles existed a parallel structure running quietly alongside the official one, untouched by suspicion. It did not rely on open violence in its early stages. Instead, it was built on paperwork, spreadsheets, schedules, and the silent authority of official seals. Nothing was decided impulsively. Transportation routes were tested methodically like controlled scientific experiments. If a shipment failed, it was carefully logged, recalibrated, and quietly reintroduced weeks later through an alternate transportation corridor. Money never arrived in sudden surges. It moved in slow, consistent streams. Over 7 years, investigators traced more than $214 million through a web of shell entities engineered to appear as charitable, medical, and administrative organizations. These included clinics that never opened, community programs that never existed, and emergency grants silently redirected into criminal operating funds. Every transaction carried a polished, respectable name and passed through hands conditioned never to ask why. The most disturbing revelation was not financial at all. Internal communications revealed they spoke about residential neighborhoods as tactical terrain. Areas were categorized by risk levels, not to safeguard residents, but to calculate where violence could unfold without attracting attention. As crime rates climbed, transportation routes were not dismantled but strengthened. When overdoses from illicit substances surged, shipments were recalibrated rather than reduced. Human lives were weighed and dismissed as acceptable losses. The governor's wife commanded the most efficient executive tier. Her network transformed public care systems into hardened logistical shields. Medical certificates became access keys, and patient records turned into flawless cover. Funds intended for elder care were quietly redirected to ensure transportation routes remained perpetually clear. This was not reckless greed, but cold, methodical discipline without conscience. They required no threats or disorder because they trusted the system to shield them, having engineered it to do precisely that. Once this reality surfaced, the investigation ceased to be merely about corruption and evolved into a full-scale lockdown campaign. At exactly 3:58 in the morning, the execution order went live, sending a synchronized vibration through the phones of special task force teams. Combat maps marked with red zones and green arrows instantly translated into real-world movement, targeting clinics and warehouses concealed as civilian facilities. Before sunrise, police had sealed every expressway leading out of Chicago with concrete barriers. At the same time, covert tactical units advanced through frozen side streets, turning weeks of meticulous planning into a vast, chillingly silent raid. Above the city, unmanned aerial vehicles rose and spread outward, their cameras cutting through rooftops, garages, and bare lines of trees. A helicopter skimmed low along the industrial corridor, its rotors sweeping thin sheets of snow from deserted loading docks. The first strike point was an aging medical supply warehouse in the southern part of the city. From the outside, it looked abandoned. Rusted signage, shattered windows, silence. But once the doors were forced open, agents entered a full-scale illicit production site, outfitted with industrial presses, chemical barrels, and vacuum sealers still warm to the touch. 72 kilograms of narcotics had been prepared for immediate distribution. 2 suspects attempted to flee but were intercepted by a K-9 unit in under 8 seconds. 20 minutes later, gunfire shattered the quiet of a residential neighborhood near Cicero. A garage door exploded open as 3 armed figures sprinted into the darkness, weaving between tightly packed houses. A drone locked onto the movement, flooding the lead suspect with a blinding spotlight. He had no idea he was already encircled. Snow erupted as agents closed in from both sides. 1 man went down, the other 2 were subdued in the backyard of a home still scattered with children's toys. By 4:40 in the morning, the operation was unfolding across the city. In the basement of an old church, beneath stained glass windows, agents uncovered pill presses and money counters concealed in the shadows. A non-profit organization's office seemed to hold nothing more than empty desks, until agents lifted a false floor and uncovered neatly packaged self-defense equipment. At a riverside dock, a truck was intercepted just minutes before departure, its manifest declaring medical relief supplies, while inside, illicit pills were stacked like textbooks. Resistance surfaced at several locations, but it was driven by panic, not coordination. Gunfire cracked, doors slammed, engines roared, and then died beneath spike strips. In a suburban raid, 1 suspect barricaded himself inside a townhouse. Negotiations collapsed, and a 12-second breach brought the standoff to an abrupt end. When the first true daylight finally broke over Chicago, 41 locations had already been dismantled. The figures were staggering. More than 312 kilograms of narcotics seized, along with $187 million in cash, gold, and digital assets. 46 weapons caches were uncovered, and more than 120 arrests were made before noon. To the public, it appeared sudden. But for the agents pushing through smoke, snow, and splintered doors, it was the release of months of relentless pressure. This was no longer a routine investigation, it was a full-scale purge, and it marked only the midpoint of the story. What surfaced next was not documented in shipping manifests or financial ledgers, but in people. As agents cross-referenced arrest records, immigration files, and field intelligence reports, a second structure began to take shape beneath the drug network. It was quieter, darker, and far more destabilizing. Narcotics were only one half of the operation. The other was human capital. Over 4 years, more than 600 men had been brought into Illinois through channels directly tied to the governor's inner circle. They arrived without families, bypassing standard resettlement pathways. They came alone, dispersed, and protected by nominal paperwork despite having no verifiable records. Their files revealed a story no press release had ever acknowledged. These were men with prior criminal records in other states, gang affiliations quietly erased, and combat scars that matched no Allied service history. Some had been flagged by alerts years earlier only for those warnings to vanish without explanation. They were not brought in for community integration, they were imported to operate the network. Investigators traced the consequences of their arrival. Within 18 months, neighborhoods along targeted corridors experienced patterns too precise to ignore. 73 shootings, 109 armed robberies, and 31 documented human trafficking cases. Each incident led back not to random acts of violence, but to groups of individuals tied to the same intake channel. The violence was not chaotic, it was deliberate. Internal communications exposed their rationale. These men were deployed to enforce territorial dominance, intimidate local opposition, and protect distribution zones that narcotics alone could not hold. When law enforcement pressure increased in one district, operations did not collapse. They shifted. Not because the network was weakening, but because it was strategically repositioning its assets. The most terrifying layer involved public funds. Some of the men carried official badges issued by medical contractors linked to the governor's wife. They wore uniforms, enjoyed unrestricted access to buildings, and moved freely through facilities meant to serve the elderly and disabled. Subsequent Medicare billing records exposed millions of dollars in fraudulent claims, reimbursements paid for care that never occurred. The money did not disappear. It was redirected to purchase firearms, vehicles, and silence. Do you still dare to trust the system when you realize the highest authority is the very place hiding the most sophisticated crimes of all? In a shooting outside a grocery store, 2 elderly people were wounded. The attacker had received $1.9 million from the state budget for care services in less than a year. Converting funds meant to protect the vulnerable into instruments of harm. This was not traditional crime, but demographic manipulation. Apartment blocks became staging grounds. Community centers turned into coordination hubs. Fear spread fastest in neighborhoods least able to resist, forcing residents to avoid certain streets, certain hours, and even certain questions. When analysts finalized the timeline, the conclusion was unavoidable. The network did not merely tolerate violence, it depended on it, using chaos as cover to shield the inner workings of the system. The case escalated into something far more dangerous when the network revealed itself as a self-sustaining system embedded deep within public institutions. This was no longer a series of isolated bribes. Every action followed a precise rhythm. Zoning approvals were granted just days before warehouses quietly changed ownership, and medical licenses were fast-tracked mere hours before illicit clinics went operational. These facilities never treated a single patient. They existed only as legal entry points for the organization, turning routine administrative procedures into flawless camouflage for large-scale crime. Traffic enforcement along key transport routes dropped sharply the same week new transportation waivers were signed. None of it was accidental. A district police commander approved temporary no-inspection orders, allowing unchecked cargo to move freely through secured corridors. A procurement officer signed off on bulk equipment purchases that were never delivered. A city planning board convened meetings lasting less than 15 minutes, during which multiple properties were rezoned without debate. Each action left a clean paper trail and appeared legitimate in isolation, but together they formed a flawless pipeline for moving goods. Bank records exposed the quiet precision of the financial layer. Transfers labeled as consulting fees, security assessments, and community partnership grants moved with exact timing. One account received $32,000 each month for nearly 2 years, registered to a sheriff who discreetly reassigned patrol units away from a critical distribution zone. Another ledger recorded $11,500 linked to a zoning approval that converted a shuttered warehouse into a repackaging hub. The emails were even more damning because they were not coded or cautious. They were blunt and unmistakable, with messages like, "Transfer the money immediately, no delays, the route has been approved." Funds moved within hours. This was governance in motion, not a whispered conspiracy in back alleys. It unfolded in broad daylight offices behind desks stacked with forms and schedules. Contributions flowed directly into government agency accounts, and community grants materialized the moment law enforcement pressure disappeared. Silence was rewarded and questions were not punished. They were simply never asked. No one could explain why official approvals aligned with the criminal organization's movements with such flawless precision. Public reaction was swift and visceral. Protests erupted outside city offices, hand-painted banners demanding answers no official was prepared to give. If the law itself is criminal, what justice remains? Inside a detention facility, Governor Hassan Abdir Rahman Noor said nothing. He neither asked for a lawyer nor voiced protest, staring straight ahead as if the structure he had depended on had finally collapsed. By the end of the week, prosecutors announced charges against more than 140 individuals. Not all were charged with trafficking. Some faced counts of falsifying records, accepting unauthorized payments, or knowingly approving fraudulent contracts. None of the charges were minor. Each name represented a deep and deliberate breach of public trust. What unsettled investigators most was not the number of people involved, but how completely ordinary they seemed. This network did not conceal itself behind guns or masks. It hid behind desks, official seals, and respected job titles. Once uncovered, it became clear the damage could not be repaired through arrests alone. Parents began rerouting their children's school commutes. Small business owners shuttered their shops earlier than usual. Longtime residents admitted they had never experienced this level of uncertainty. Street crime had always been frightening, but this was different. It flowed downward from the very top. It revealed that even the mechanisms of protection had been compromised. Inside detention facilities, interrogations unfolded with little spectacle. Some defendants broke down in tears, others insisted on their innocence, and one quietly whispered that he assumed everyone already knew. Others immediately demanded lawyers. One pattern remained clear. When a system collapses, no one wants to be the last person left holding its weight. Amid the collapse, the system revealed a fierce resilience through individuals of integrity who chose to break the silence. Analysts worked relentlessly through the night to recover buried data, while courageous witnesses accepted personal risk to provide critical evidence. From the nurse who safeguarded records of irregular payments, to the officer who refused a bribe slipped into an envelope, to the bank employee who secretly printed transaction statements in the dead of night, each became a pillar of the case. Their actions proved that no matter how deeply corruption spreads, it can never fully erase every remaining trace of conscience. By the end of the week, evidence storage rooms were overflowing. The value of seized assets had climbed past $150 million in cash and property. The volume of narcotics confiscated was enough to devastate entire cities, yet the numbers no longer stunned investigators. What stayed with them were the names, officials, administrators, community leaders whose authority had once offered reassurance. In a downtown courtroom left empty, the flags still stood upright and the space looked unchanged, but anyone who entered could feel that something essential was missing. Justice had been administered there for years while a parallel system functioned quietly in its shadow. That realization settled like a weight over the entire state. Institutions do not collapse in an instant. They decay through convenience, silence, and signatures that once seemed trivial. What comes next will require years of reform, prosecution, and the slow reconstruction of trust, brick by brick. But one truth stood unmistakably clear. This was not the end of a scandal. It was the beginning of a far larger purge. The arrests dismantled the network's operations, but they could not reverse the harm already done. In the weeks that followed, Illinois did not spiral into chaos. Something far more corrosive settled in: doubt. Trust, once fractured, does not break loudly. It erodes in silence, draining from conversations, institutions, and daily routines until people no longer know where real power truly resides. Politically, the consequences were swift and irreversible. Committees were dissolved overnight. The aftermath of the case empowered oversight agencies with genuine authority, as voters demanded transparency instead of empty speeches. Funding freezes for audits brought parts of the system to a standstill, forcing ordinary residents to absorb the greatest losses. The scandal became a national warning. Modern infiltration of government no longer depends on brute force, but on clean records, time, and patience. In response, federal background check standards were tightened, shifting emphasis toward financial behavior and irregular associations rather than criminal history alone, an effort to prevent political advancement from being weaponized to corrupt the machinery of power from the inside. The fallout from the case granted oversight agencies real authority as voters demanded transparency instead of hollow speeches. A freeze on audit funding paralyzed large parts of the system, forcing ordinary residents to carry the heaviest burden. The scandal became a national warning. Modern government infiltration no longer depends on violence, but on clean records, patience, and time. In response, federal background check standards were tightened, shifting attention toward financial behavior and irregular associations rather than criminal history alone, in an effort to prevent political advancement from being weaponized to corrupt the machinery of power from within. The purge in Chicago was not simply the dismantling of a criminal syndicate, it was a stark warning about how fragile trust truly is. When power is quietly bent for personal gain from within, silence and complacency become the soil where corruption thrives. Those seemingly minor signatures and convenient decisions have produced consequences too vast to measure, felt by an entire community. What do you think about this level of sophisticated infiltration of the state apparatus? Is the system we rely on every day genuinely secure? Share your thoughts in the comments using the keyword "the truth" so we can discuss together, and don't forget to subscribe to follow the next shocking developments.